What if I told you that behind France's glittering palaces and velvet thrones lurked a world of poison, incest, torture, and forbidden rituals? That the very people draped in silk and diamonds, those who demanded your loyalty and your taxes, from queens accused of sleeping with their own children, to nobles who turned murder into entertainment, to kings whose mistresses sought the devil's blessing at midnight, this is not myth, this is history. So, what do you think? Were they victims of rumor, or monsters hiding in plain sight? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the horrifying truths buried beneath the elegance of history. In the spring of 1314, one of the darkest scandals in French royal history erupted, tearing through the Capetian dynasty like a storm. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, had spent his reign tightening control over the kingdom, enforcing a rigid image of divine monarchy. Yet behind the walls of the royal household, the women destined to secure his dynasty's future were accused of acts so shameful, so unthinkable, that the prestige of France itself trembled. His 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, were heirs to one of Europe's most powerful thrones. Their wives, Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Navarre, were expected to embody the highest virtues of purity and loyalty. But in Paris, whispers began to circulate, whispers of stolen nights, of passion carried out not with kings or princes, but with 2 low-born knights, Philip and Gaudier de Nesle. The secret, once released, spread like wildfire. Adultery within the royal bloodline was not a mere betrayal of marriage vows. It was an insult to the throne, a stain on the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. The alleged meetings between the princesses and their lovers became infamous under the name the Tour de Nesle Affair. According to the accusations, the 2 knights would meet the princesses in a tower along the Seine, disguising themselves to avoid suspicion. Wine, laughter, and carnal pleasures filled the nights in that clandestine fortress, while Paris outside remained unaware that its future queens were entangled in scandal. For months, perhaps years, these meetings went on, until betrayal from within exposed it all. It is said that the suspicion was first raised by Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV and Queen of England. During a visit to Paris, she noticed that the princesses possessed gifts, finely embroidered purses, identical to those she had once given her brothers. Doubt turned into certainty, and Isabella revealed her suspicions to her father. A secret investigation followed, and soon the knights were caught. What they endured would forever mark this scandal as one of the most brutal punishments for adultery in medieval Europe. The de Nesle brothers were seized, interrogated, and subjected to horrific torture to extract confessions. Their bones were broken, their skin torn, and in the public square of Paris, their bodies were humiliated before execution. Accounts describe how they were flayed alive, castrated, and finally beheaded, their corpses left to rot as a warning to all who might betray the crown. It was not enough to kill them. Their punishment had to echo, to terrify, to demonstrate that royal honor was a sacred thing never to be defiled. The princesses, though spared the blade, suffered fates designed to annihilate their dignity. Margaret of Burgundy, wife of the future King Louis X, was confined to Chateau-Gaillard, a fortress prison. There she languished in isolation, her reputation forever destroyed. Within a year, she was dead, officially of illness, though many believed she was strangled or starved to prevent her from ever becoming queen. Blanche of Burgundy faced lifelong imprisonment, while Joan of Navarre escaped with her life and crown only because her husband, Philip V, defended her innocence. The dynasty never fully recovered from the shock. The Capetian line was shaken to its core. Margaret's disgrace and death meant that when Louis X ascended the throne, his reign began under a cloud of scandal. The very legitimacy of royal children was questioned, for if queens could betray kings, how secure was the bloodline of France? These doubts would haunt the monarchy for decades, feeding into the instability that eventually ended the direct Capetian line and ushered in a new dynasty. The Tour de Nesle Affair became more than a scandal. It became a curse in the eyes of many. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries now seemed tainted, its women remembered not for their beauty or power, but for forbidden passion that destroyed reputations and lives. France had witnessed not just a crime of the flesh, but the public unraveling of the sacred marriage between monarchy and morality. Centuries later, the tale still chills. It was not simply the adultery of princesses or the deaths of knights, but the cruel spectacle of power enforcing its will. Love turned into betrayal, passion turned into mutilation, and the throne of France, once untouchable, stood scarred by the memory of a tower where royal honor was undone. When Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533 as the young bride of Henry, Duke of Orleans, she seemed an unremarkable Italian princess, a pawn in dynastic politics. Yet in the decades that followed, her name would become synonymous with fear. To her enemies, she was La Reine Noire, the Black Queen, a woman whispered to practice sorcery, poisons, and dark plots to preserve her fragile hold on power. Whether truth or rumor, her reputation grew into one of the most chilling legacies of any queen in French history. Catherine's marriage to Henry was cold and humiliating. Her husband adored another woman, the elegant and commanding Diane de Poitiers, who monopolized his affection for decades. Catherine, childless for the first 10 years of her marriage, became desperate. To secure her place, she turned to astrologers, alchemists, and physicians, demanding potions and rituals to overcome her barrenness. When she finally bore children, her obsession with their survival became the defining force of her life. Every intrigue, every whispered scheme, every suspected crime was justified by her determination to secure the throne for her sons. At court, stories of Catherine's secret chambers began to circulate. Hidden rooms in her palaces were said to contain drawers filled with vials of strange powders and liquids. Some believed she kept an arsenal of poisons, ready to be slipped into a rival's cup or sprinkled on a feast. Though historians debate how much was fact and how much was paranoia, the image of Catherine as a mistress of poison stuck, reinforced by sudden and convenient deaths among her political enemies. She was not only seen as a queen, but as a woman whose very touch could be lethal. Her husband Henry's infidelities fueled her jealous fury. Accounts describe her drilling peafols into her own chambers to watch him with Diane de Poitiers, an act that seemed both pitiful and sinister. The neglected wife transformed into a calculating observer, recording, learning, and plotting in silence. Court gossip insisted that Catherine's jealous watchfulness was the seed of her future cruelty. She could not command her husband's heart, but she would command the fate of France itself. When Henry VII died in 1559, Catherine's role changed forever. As queen mother and regent to her sons, she stood at the center of France's bloody religious wars. It was during this period that her reputation as the Black Queen reached its height. She surrounded herself with astrologers and seers, most famously Nostradamus, and was said to consult the stars before making any political decision. Her flying squadron of beautiful ladies in waiting, women trained to seduce and extract secrets from powerful men, were another tool of manipulation, turning the court into a theater of intrigue where sexuality became an instrument of statecraft. Her darkest association remains the stain, Bartholomew's Dacre of 1572. Thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across France after a night of wedding celebrations meant to bring peace between Catholics and Protestants. Though the exact extent of her role remains debated, Catherine's name was forever tied to the rivers of blood that flowed through the streets. To her enemies, it was proof that her cruelty matched her ambition, that she had sacrificed human lives to preserve her dynasty. Whether she truly kept cabinets of poison or orchestrated every murder attributed to her is impossible to know. Much of her image was shaped by her rivals, who painted her as a Machiavellian witch to justify their own hatred. But in the imagination of her contemporaries, Catherine de' Medici was more than a queen. She was an embodiment of dread, a woman whose presence at court meant danger, whose smiles hid daggers, and whose maternal devotion transformed into obsession. By the time of her death in 1589, Catherine had seen 3 of her sons crowned kings of France, yet she left behind a kingdom broken, scarred by civil war, and haunted by her shadow. To the people, she was remembered not as a mother or stateswoman, but as the Black Queen, the woman who poisoned France, both literally and metaphorically. Versailles was the dream of Louis XIV, the Sun King. He built it to dazzle the world, a palace of endless corridors, gilded mirrors, and gardens carved into living geometry. To the outside eye, it was the very embodiment of order, majesty, and divine authority. Yet to those who lived inside its walls, Versailles was something else entirely, a gilded cage where lust, rivalry, and ambition rotted the nobility from within. Beneath the golden ceilings, the court was not only a theater of power, but a brothel in all but name. Louis XIV himself set the tone. Though he presented himself as the chosen ruler of God, he filled Versailles with his lovers. Mistresses were paraded as openly as queens, their children acknowledged and provided for, while his legitimate wife stood in quiet humiliation. Every nobleman and noblewoman watched closely, for the king's bed was a path to influence, a passage to wealth, titles, and power. Women of noble blood jostled for his attention, dressing in costumes that glittered by candlelight, whispering sweet words at masked balls, hoping that a single night might bind their family closer to the throne. But the king's lust was not his alone. Versailles was designed as a trap, a place where the nobility could be watched, controlled, and kept in constant competition. Courtiers abandoned their estates and their independence to live in cramped rooms within the palace, fighting endlessly for the honor of serving the king's most trivial needs. Jealousy and seduction became weapons in this grand game. Husbands and wives betrayed one another for advancement. Fathers pushed daughters into the arms of princes. Mothers skimmed in silence, offering beauty as currency. Every smile, every dance, every stolen glance was calculated. The palace itself seemed built for secrets. Behind the grand halls lay hidden passages, narrow staircases, and private chambers where lovers met in silence. Gossip filled the air as much as music did. It was whispered that during masquerades, identities vanished, and even the highest ladies of France indulged in pleasures far from the eyes of their husbands. Illegitimate children were born in alarming numbers, their existence quietly acknowledged yet never officially spoken of. These children, bastards of the Sun King and his courtiers, were living proof of a court drowning in excess. But Versailles was not only a nest of affairs. It was a stage for humiliation. The king's mistresses wielded power like queens, and real queens were forced to accept their presence with silent resignation. The queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, endured years of disgrace as Louis flaunted his lovers before her. Later, Madame de Montespan, the most famous of his mistresses, was accused of involvement in the affair of the poisons, a scandal that revealed a hidden world of black masses, curses, and whispered sorcery at the heart of Versailles. To outsiders, Versailles glittered. To those inside, it stank of corruption, both spiritual and moral. Ambition made people reckless. Rivalries between mistresses became battles of influence. Women poisoned one another with powders slipped into food and drink. Priests were bribed to perform secret rites of fertility and curse. Love potions, aphrodisiacs, and hexes were bought in the shadows of Paris and carried back to the gilded halls. Each scandal was carefully buried, but the rot spread deeper. The palace that claimed to be the center of civilization became infamous as a breeding ground of vice, a world where every virtue could be bought and every sin was committed in pursuit of royal favor. By the time Louis XIV's reign drew to a close, Versailles had become both the pride and shame of France. Its fountains sparkled, its gardens bloomed, its chambers glowed with candlelight. But its name was forever stained by whispers of orgies, poisonings, and secret births. The nobility who once served as the pillars of the realm had been transformed into desperate courtesans, selling not only their loyalty, but their dignity. Versailles was the Sun King's triumph, yet also his curse, a golden temple that revealed the corruption of absolute monarchy in all its splendor and shadow. In the mid-17th century, France shuddered beneath one of the most horrifying scandals of its age. At the center of it stood Marie Madeleine d'Aubray, better known to history as the Marquise de Brinvilliers. Born into wealth and privilege, she was a woman of charm and refinement, yet beneath her polished manners lurked a cruelty that would earn her the name of the poisonous tigress. Her story revealed not only the depth of her own depravity, but also the dark undercurrent of a society where power, greed, and lust eroded the boundaries of morality. Marie was married into nobility, but her life soon became entangled with lovers and conspiracies. Restless and consumed by desires both romantic and financial, she turned to poison as her weapon of choice. It was not sudden rage that drove her, but a cold and deliberate patience. She studied arsenic as though it were an art, mixing powders and testing doses until she could strike with absolute precision. Her first victims were the most intimate, her own father and brothers. With every slow, agonizing death, she inherited wealth and greater freedom. The poisoner's mask of grief hid her true triumph. What made her crimes even more chilling was her indifference to human suffering. In pursuit of perfecting her methods, she is said to have tested her poisons on the helpless. Patients in hospitals already weakened by disease became unwilling participants in her experiments. Their convulsions, their cries, their quiet deaths. To her, these were not tragedies but data points. It was as though life itself had become a laboratory, and she its merciless overseer. In the shadow of her cruelty, the sanctity of family, charity, and religion was mocked and destroyed. Her downfall came not through remorse but through exposure. Her lover and accomplice, Captain Gaudin de Sainty-Croix, died unexpectedly, and with him was discovered a cache of letters and documents detailing their murderous plots. The evidence was undeniable. The scandal tore through Parisian society like wildfire. That a noblewoman, elegant, educated, and respected, could be guilty of such monstrous acts struck terror into every family of rank. If the bonds of blood could be betrayed so easily, who was safe? Marie fled, but she was hunted down across borders, dragged back in chains to face justice. Her trial riveted the nation. The courtroom heard the accounts of her victims, the testimony of those who saw her experiments, and the damning letters that sealed her fate. She attempted to deny, then to excuse, but her words could not mask the horror of her deeds. The mask of aristocratic dignity had been ripped away, leaving only the image of a woman who had fed on death. Her execution was as public as her crimes were secret. In 1676, she was paraded through Paris, forced to confess, and finally burned at the stake after her body was broken. The flames consumed not only her flesh, but the illusion of safety that had surrounded the French nobility. Crowds gathered not merely to see justice done, but to confront the abyss her life had opened. The Marquise de Brinvilliers became a symbol of corruption within the highest circles of society, a reminder that wealth and refinement could conceal rot of the darkest kind. The story of the poisonous tigress haunted France long after the smoke of her execution faded. Her name was whispered in tales of fear, her deeds became warnings told to children, and her shadow lingered over Versailles itself, where rumors of poison and secret deaths never truly ceased. In her cruelty, she embodied the terrifying possibility that evil was not confined to dungeons and battlefields, but could wear the face of nobility, walk the halls of palaces, and sit at the family table. In the late 17th century, Paris whispered a name with both fear and fascination. Catherine de Chaise, remembered by history as La Voisin. To the poor, she was a midwife and fortune teller. To the nobility, she was something far darker. Behind her modest home and discreet reputation, she built a hidden empire of vice and sorcery. She sold powders and potions that promised to heal or to kill, charms to seduce lovers, and poisons to rid one of rivals. In the shadows of the city, she became the supplier of the aristocracy's darkest desires. Her clients came cloaked in secrecy, noble ladies, ambitious courtiers, even members of the royal household. They arrived not for healing but for power. Some sought potions to inflame passion, others begged for remedies to ensure fertility, while many demanded poisons to clear away husbands, mistresses, or competitors. What began as whispered services soon grew into an underground market of death and desire. For a price, La Voisin could provide solutions that no priest would bless and no court of law would acknowledge. The rumors surrounding her were more terrifying still. She was said to perform black masses, ceremonies that desecrated holy symbols in pursuit of supernatural aid. Infants, it was whispered, were sacrificed upon makeshift altars, their blood mixed into potions meant to bind or to destroy. Whether all of these accounts were true remains uncertain, but what is beyond doubt is the fear they instilled. In a society where faith and superstition coexisted uneasily, Lavoisian became the living embodiment of both sin and power. Her downfall was not due to morality but politics. The affair of the poisons, as it came to be called, exploded when investigators uncovered a vast network of poisoners, witches, and conspirators working in Paris. At its center stood Lavoisian. The scandal reached terrifying heights when the names of her clients were revealed. Among them were nobles of the highest order, including the king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan. It was whispered that Montespan had turned to Lavoisian to keep Louis XIV's affection, using potions and curses to bind the Sun King's heart. The revelations threatened to destroy the monarchy itself. If those closest to the throne had sought love through sorcery and secured their power with poison, what did that say of the divine right of kings? Versailles trembled under the weight of suspicion, and the court scrambled to suppress the worst of the rumors. Many of Lavoisian's clients were quietly silenced, their names erased from records, but the stench of corruption lingered. Lavoisian herself was arrested in 1679. Her trial revealed fragments of her dealings, the sale of poisons hidden in perfume bottles, the creation of love charms, the whispers of rituals carried out in the night. Witnesses spoke of gatherings filled with incense and chanting, of desperate nobles begging for supernatural intervention. Though she denied much, the evidence was overwhelming. She was condemned not only as a poisoner but as a witch, a servant of death, whose trade had corrupted the very heart of France. In 1680, she was executed by burning in Paris. Crowds gathered to watch as the flames consumed her, yet the execution brought no comfort. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many names had been carefully concealed. Her death closed her mouth, but it did not erase the terror she had inspired. Lavoisian had revealed something unbearable, that beneath the splendor of Versailles lay a festering underworld of crime, sorcery, and secret desires. Her shadow haunted France long after her ashes were scattered. She was not merely a woman who dealt in poisons, but a mirror held up to the ruling class, exposing the corruption that flourished when ambition outgrew morality. In her fall, the nobility caught a glimpse of their own decay, a reminder that in the back streets of Paris, the glitter of power was indistinguishable from the stench of death. Of all the mistresses of Louis XIV, none shone brighter than Franz Oisathe Nanars de Rochechouart de Mortemart, better known as Madame de Montespan. She was not merely beautiful, she was witty, ambitious, and commanding, a woman who could captivate the Sun King himself. For years, she reigned as the uncrowned Queen of Versailles, eclipsing the true queen and bending courtiers to her will. Yet behind the golden facade of power, whispers began to circulate, whispers so dark that they threatened to shatter her legacy forever. It was said that Montespan, desperate to maintain the king's love, turned to forbidden rites. Rumors tied her name to Lavoisian, the infamous poisoner of Paris. In hidden chambers far from the glitter of Versailles, she was accused of taking part in black masses, ceremonies that mocked the sacred, where the holy altar was replaced by a naked body, where prayers were twisted into blasphemies, and where blood, both animal and human, might be offered in exchange for supernatural aid. The accusations painted a picture of the king's most beloved mistress bowing not before God, but before the infernal. The story was irresistible to her enemies. Versailles was already rife with scandal, but this was different. This was not mere adultery or court intrigue. This was sacrilege of the highest order. To imagine that the Sun King, the man who styled himself as God's representative on earth, might share his bed with a woman accused of diabolic rites was unthinkable. Yet the whispers grew louder, feeding on every glance, every rumor, every unexplained shift in the king's affections. What gave the rumors such terrible weight was the timing. Montespan's influence over Louis had begun to wane. New rivals emerged, younger, fresher, eager to claim the king's favor. The once invincible mistress found herself slipping, and desperation clung to her like a shadow. To her enemies, this desperation was proof. Surely only sorcery could explain how she had once captivated the monarch so completely. Surely only curses could have held his devotion for so long. The affair of the poisons, already tearing through Paris, cast its net wider with every revelation. Names of noble clients emerged, and Montespan's was whispered among them. Investigators dared not speak too openly, for to accuse the king's mistress was to accuse the monarchy itself. Yet fragments of testimony survived. Accounts of her commissioning potions, of her presence at black masses, of her pleas for unholy blessings to keep Louis's passion aflame. Whether these accusations were entirely true or merely the invention of rivals remains uncertain. But in the court of Versailles, appearances were as damning as facts. The stain of scandal clung to Montespan, and though Louis never publicly condemned her, their relationship cooled. She was gradually pushed aside, her power fading like the candlelight after a ball. The woman who once ruled the Sun King's heart was left to watch from the shadows, her reputation forever scarred. Her fall from grace was not sudden but relentless. Once adored and envied, she became a figure of suspicion, a cautionary tale whispered in corridors. To the devout, she symbolized the dangers of vanity and ambition unchecked by piety. To the superstitious, she was proof that sorcery lurked even at the heart of France's most splendid court. Versailles, no matter how brightly it glittered, could not erase the shadows cast by her alleged sins. In the end, Madame de Montespan lived out her days in quiet exile, her influence gone but her infamy eternal. She never stood trial, never confessed, never faced the flames that consumed Lavoisin. Yet history remembers her not only as the king's grandest mistress, but also as the mistress of the midnight mass, a woman whose ambition was said to reach beyond the earthly and into the infernal. Her story left Versailles forever haunted by suspicion, a reminder that beneath the golden ceilings and sacred ceremonies of monarchy, France's most powerful court could still tremble at the whisper of sorcery. If Versailles had been the glittering stage of France's nobility, then Donation Alphonse Franois, the Marquis de Sade, was its darkest echo. Born into wealth and privilege in the 18th century, Sade inherited the freedom to indulge in any excess. Yet where others pursued luxury, he pursued cruelty. His name would become synonymous with perversion so shocking that history itself recoiled. What he did in secret chambers and later recorded in pages of fevered prose turned him into the very embodiment of aristocratic corruption and moral collapse. Sade's life was a long catalogue of scandal. From his youth, he cultivated a hunger not for love or companionship, but for domination. He sought pleasure in humiliation, torture, and the breaking of human dignity. Women and girls, servants and prostitutes, none were safe from his cruelty. He lured them with promises of wealth or forced them into his chambers, where drugs, restraints, and calculated torments awaited. Their cries were not accidents of passion, but the purpose of his pleasure. He fed upon fear, pain, and degradation, treating human beings as objects to be destroyed at will. His crimes became public often enough to scandalize Paris. He was arrested multiple times for acts of violence and abuse, only to be shielded by his noble rank and family influence. Each release emboldened him further. Whispers of orgies, abductions, and ritualized cruelty followed him everywhere. The courts of law and the courts of Versailles alike knew his name, and both turned away in disgust. Yet it was not disgust alone that made him infamous. It was the chilling way he transformed cruelty into philosophy. In prison, stripped of freedom but not of imagination, Sade began to write. What emerged from his pen was not apology or reflection, but an avalanche of words that celebrated cruelty as a form of liberation. His books, Justine Juliet, The 120 Days of Sodom, depicted worlds where virtue was punished, innocence destroyed, and the most grotesque forms of violence became the highest pleasures. His writings read like confessions and manifestos, manuals of suffering that erased all boundaries between man and monster. To read them was to stare into the abyss of a mind unrestrained by morality. The Marquis de Sade became both symbol and warning. To his critics, he embodied everything that was rotting within France's nobility. Indulgence without morality, power without restraint, privilege turned into a theater of pain. He was not merely a man of vices, but a man who turned vice into doctrine, insisting that cruelty itself was the most honest expression of human desire. His name, torn from his life, gave birth to a new word, sadism. forever linking his legacy to the infliction of suffering for pleasure. Yet his infamy was not confined to whispers or hidden books. The times themselves magnified his significance. As revolution brewed in France, the Marquis de Sade stood as proof to the people of how far the nobility had fallen. If this was what privilege created, if this was what aristocracy protected, then the monarchy's decay was complete. Sade was not merely an individual, but an omen, a grotesque reflection of a ruling class so insulated from morality that it could nurture monsters in its midst. He would spend much of his life behind bars, condemned by kings and revolutionaries alike, yet he never repented. Even in confinement, he wrote, producing visions of horror that would outlive him. When he died in 1814, the world did not mourn. His family sought to erase his memory, to bury his name in silence. Yet history refused to let him vanish. His legacy lived on as a curse, not only upon himself but upon the nobility he represented. The Marquis de Sade's life was not simply the story of a man's depravity. It was the revelation of what power becomes when stripped of conscience, when cruelty is elevated to pleasure, and when privilege protects evil rather than restrains it. He was, and remains, the Marquis of Cruelty, a nobleman whose shadow still haunts the darkest corners of history. The revolution had already consumed France in fire and fury, but the spectacle reserved for Marie Antoinette was unlike anything the world had seen. The Queen, once the radiant, Austrian bride, who arrived at Versailles in glittering ceremony, now stood as a broken figure before the revolutionary tribunal. No longer a monarch, she was simply the widow Capet, stripped of her title, stripped of her jewels, and soon stripped of her life. Yet even the guillotine would not satisfy her enemies. Before the blade could fall, her body and her reputation had to be desecrated. The charges began with treason, but they did not end there. The prosecutors wanted more than blood. They wanted shame, humiliation, and degradation. They painted her not only as a conspirator against France, but as the embodiment of aristocratic corruption. In their venomous accusations, the Queen became a monster. She was accused of orchestrating secret orgies within Versailles, of indulging in perversions behind the gilded mirrors of the palace, of debasing the throne of France with pleasures unfit to name. The most grotesque charge came when they accused her of incest with her own young son. In the crowded tribunal, the words dropped like poison. The gallery gasped, some with horror, others with gleeful hatred. For Marie Antoinette, this was the ultimate cruelty. She had already lost her husband, her crown, and her freedom. But to be branded as a mother who had corrupted her own child was a wound deeper than any blade could carve. In her defense, she did not scream or plead. Instead, she rose slowly, pale and wary, and addressed the women in the room. "Nature refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother," she declared. "I appeal to all mothers here." Could you imagine it? Her words did not exonerate her, but they struck like a spark of humanity in a chamber intent on denying her any shred of it. But truth was never the concern of the tribunal. The revolution was theater, and Marie Antoinette was cast as the villainess of a dying age. To the revolutionaries, she was not a woman but a symbol. The Austrian whore, the decadent queen who danced while Paris starved, the embodiment of all the sins of Versailles. Her body was turned into a canvas upon which the hatred of a nation could be painted. As the trial drew to its inevitable conclusion, the crowd outside roared for her death. The sentence was read guilty of treason, guilty of debauchery, guilty of every vile act that could be imagined. The Queen would be executed. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she was led from her cell. Her once golden hair had been shorn close, her silks replaced with a plain white shift. She climbed into the cart that would carry her through the streets of Paris, where once the people had craned their necks to glimpse her in carriages of gold. Now they jeered at her as she rode to death in a rough wooden tumbrel. Yet even in humiliation, Marie Antoinette carried herself with a strange dignity. She did not weep, she did not beg. Witnesses described her as composed, her back straight, her eyes cold and distant. She was no longer the Queen of Versailles, but she would not allow them to see her broken. At the Place de la Révolution, she ascended the scaffold. The blade loomed above her, glinting in the autumn light. In that moment, She ceased to be merely a woman. She became the sacrifice for centuries of excess, arrogance, and corruption. The revolution would not only kill her body, it would annihilate the idea of monarchy itself. The blade fell, and the crowd erupted. For some, it was justice. For others, it was revenge. But beneath the cheers lurked something darker. The Queen's death was not only a political act, it was the symbolic execution of an entire world. Versailles, with its endless mirrors and its secret sins, had been dragged into the streets and beheaded with her. Marie Antoinette's trial and execution revealed the revolution's true hunger, not just for freedom, but for spectacle, for blood, and for the destruction of all that had once seemed untouchable. In the end, the Queen was not condemned for what she had done, but for what she represented. The last glittering mask of aristocratic sin shattered beneath the blade of the guillotine. The death of the King and Queen was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a far more ruthless chapter. Once the guillotine had tasted royal blood, it demanded more. The revolution, which had promised liberty and justice, now became a machine of vengeance. What began as the downfall of monarchy soon spiraled into a season of fear, where suspicion was enough to condemn, and the whisper of betrayal could cost a life. The guillotine stood in Paris like an idol, its blade falling day after day. At first, it devoured aristocrats. Noblemen and noblewomen, once untouchable in their gilded salons, now trudged through the mud to their deaths. Their silks were stripped, their titles erased, their heads displayed to the cheering crowd. For the revolutionaries, this was not only justice, it was ritual purification. Each drop of blood was imagined as cleansing France of centuries of corruption and excess. But the hunger for vengeance was insatiable. After the nobles, suspicion turned to priests, merchants, neighbors, even fellow revolutionaries. Entire families were dragged before the tribunals. A word spoken in anger, a letter intercepted, or simply a past connection to the old regime could be enough to send a person to the blade. Mothers, fathers, and children alike marched to their deaths. France, which had risen in the name of freedom, was now drowning in its own paranoia. In the countryside, the revolution's fury unleashed civil wars and massacres. In the Vendée, peasants who resisted the new order were slaughtered without mercy. Fires consumed entire villages, rivers ran red with corpses. The revolution's dream of equality was buried beneath piles of bodies. Terror was no longer a tool, it was a way of life. Robespierre, one of the revolution's fiercest voices, declared that terror was prompt, severe, inflexible justice. To him, it was necessary, a means of protecting the fragile new republic. But to the thousands who perished, it was nothing more than cruelty disguised as virtue. Guillotines rose not only in Paris but in cities across France, their blades slicing through the noble, the commoner, the innocent, and the guilty alike. Children grew up with death as their daily spectacle. Streets that once echoed with the music of Versailles now echoed with drums leading the condemned to execution. The same crowds that had once starved outside the palace now gathered eagerly to watch heads roll, as though vengeance itself could fill their bellies. The line between justice and bloodlust had vanished. The irony was inescapable. The revolution that had sworn to destroy tyranny became tyrannical itself. The monarchy's sins had unleashed a fury that could not be contained. In seeking to cleanse France of corruption, the revolution had created new corruption of its own, one born not of decadence, but of cruelty, suspicion, and fear. By the height of the terror, even the architects of the revolution were devoured by it. Danton H.A. Burt, and finally Robespierre himself fell to the same guillotine they had once commanded. The blade showed no loyalty. It consumed without discrimination. What had begun as the people's weapon against oppression became a symbol of oppression itself. When the terror finally subsided, France was left scarred beyond recognition. Thousands had been executed, countless more imprisoned, tortured, or driven into exile. Families were shattered, entire communities silenced. The revolution had toppled the nobility, but in its fury, it had scarred the very soul of the nation. The sins of the aristocracy had awakened a vengeance too great to control. It consumed palaces, then churches, then villages, and finally its own creators. In the end, the guillotine did not simply cut down individuals, It carved a wound into France itself, a wound that would never fully heal, and whose echoes would haunt generations to come. The fall of the monarchy was not simply the end of a dynasty, it was the death of an illusion. For centuries, France's aristocracy had cloaked itself in silk, jewels, and divine authority. They had claimed to be the guardians of culture, the patrons of art, the chosen vessels of God's will. Yet beneath the layers of splendor, their private lives told another story, one of cruelty, corruption, and moral decay. When the revolution tore away the veil, the people saw not gods in human form, but flawed mortals rotting from within. What remained after the guillotine was not merely political change, but cultural memory. The stories of incest, poison, hidden chambers, and forbidden rituals did not fade with the deaths of their perpetrators. Instead, they became folklore, dark warnings whispered across generations. Even when exaggerated or distorted, these tales carried a truth that no execution could erase: that unchecked power, when married to human desire, can descend into unimaginable depravity. Versailles, once the symbol of absolute monarchy, became in memory a palace of shadows, a glittering mask hiding unspeakable sins. For the people of France, remembering these scandals was a way of making sense of their suffering. Starvation, taxes, wars fought in the name of royal ambition. All of it was easier to bear when framed against stories of noble excess. If children starved while queens feasted, if peasants froze while kings built golden fountains, then the revolution had been not just political necessity, but moral justice. The scandals of the court, whether entirely true or embellished in rumor, became part of the revolution's justification, etched into the nation's collective conscience. Yet these echoes were not confined to the revolution alone. They rippled outward into the centuries that followed. French literature, art, and philosophy often returned to the image of the corrupt noble, the libertine who mocked morality, the poisoner who killed without remorse, the queen accused of sins both real and imagined. The aristocracy, once admired, was now a cautionary figure in the cultural imagination. Their downfall was not just history, it became myth, retold as a parable of what happens when power is worshipped without restraint. In the grand portraits that still hang in museums, kings and queens stare out in regal stillness. But those who walk past them now see more than beauty. They see the ghosts of scandal, whispers of affairs, of dark chambers, of secrets buried beneath powdered wigs and velvet gowns. Time has not erased their sins, it has immortalized them. The elegance of their images is forever haunted by the knowledge of what lay beneath. The revolution ended the reign of the French aristocracy, but it did not end the human hunger for power or the dangers that come with it. The guillotine silenced kings and queens, yet across history and across nations, the same patterns reemerge: corruption, cruelty, and indulgence at the expense of the powerless. The echoes of France's fallen nobles remind us that the story of power is never only about politics. It is about the darkness of human desire, repeated again and again. In the end, the aristocracy left behind more than palaces and ruins. They left behind a warning carved into the memory of a nation, that no amount of splendor can hide corruption forever. That behind every gilded throne, there may lie shadows too deep to ignore, and that when power forgets morality, it invites not loyalty, but vengeance. The monarchy may have fallen, but its sins live on, echoing through time. Whispers in the corridors of Versailles, shadows in the history of France, reminders that beneath the brilliance of power always lurks the possibility of ruin.